Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the WISE Public Lecture Series. My name is Tracy Forrest. I'm the director of the Waterloo Institute for Sustainable Energy. And I am delighted, it's my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Brenda Kenny with us today. She'll be addressing the topic of Canadian responsibility in the energy trilemma. And Dr. Brenda Kenny is the president and CEO of the Canadian Energy Plastics Association, where she works with industry partners to develop industry positions and advocacy related to a wide range of issues, including safety, environmental responsibilities, regulatory efficiency, financial competitiveness, and reputation. Brenda has extensive experience in energy regulation, sustainability, and strategy development. Prior to joining CEPA, she spent a number of years with the National Energy Board, where she provided executive leadership in policy, regulatory reviews, and finance. Brenda is an adjunct professor in the Heiskane School of Business at the University of Calgary. She serves on the Board of Governors for the University of Calgary, chairs the board's Environment, Health, Safety, and Sustainability Committee, and sits on the board of the Climate Change and Emissions Management Corporation, which is an Alberta independent not-for-profit that invests in clean tech solutions. Brenda was recently appointed to the board of the Alberta Economic Development Authority to provide strategic advice on diversifying the economy and improving Alberta's competitiveness. Brenda is also a Canadian Academy of Engineering Fellow, a member of the Institute of Corporate Directors, and has been active in a variety of boards and community groups, including WaterSmart, the Calgary Chamber of Commerce, Sustainable Calgary, and Imagine Calgary. Brenda holds a doctorate in resources and the environment, a master's in mechanical engineering, I believe from the University
from Waterloo, yoo-hoo!
And a bachelor of applied science. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Brenda.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, it's just a real pleasure to be here. I should just first check. I have a mic on. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Yes? If you can't, just hold up your hand. I'm never shy to shout a little louder. And really, really looking forward to this evening. What I love the most about these kind of get-togethers is your questions. So I'm going to tee us up, hopefully with a few remarks that get things going, but I really, really look forward to an opportunity to discuss what's on your mind and what kind of questions come up. So pipelines is where I come from at this point in time, and we have become a bit of a lightning rod for a lot of the energy and environment discussions in Canada. So I want to try to provide some context from what I'm seeing working in pipelines, and also looking at that energy and environment picture a little bit more broadly. I do live in Calgary now. I'm a proud Albertan, and I grew up in Montreal, went to school in Ontario and worked here, and I also spent about 5 years working and living in British Columbia. So I say that up front because, as I was discussing before the lecture, what we're facing, I think, really is a phenomenally important pan-Canadian set of issues, a really important time for pan-Canadian dialogue. And while a lot of what we'll talk about today has root solutions in technology and innovation, it starts with values, and it starts with really asking ourselves some very important questions. So I'm hoping that this conversation can illuminate some of that. And I'll start off by mentioning things like fossil fuels and hydrocarbons and fracking and petrochem, oil sands, and I'm betting that when I say those things, the first thing that comes to mind is not sustainability or decreasing GHG emissions or investments in alternative energy. I'm betting you didn't think about wind farms and solar, smart cars, or any of the above, or maybe even didn't think about providing secure and reliable access to energy. But I bet you do care a lot about all those things. The things you might call good and the things you might call bad. And I'm betting that you feel pretty anxious, at least I do, about the way forward on things like security, sustainability, and at the same time, economic prosperity. You'll hear me talk about economics, and I want to make it very clear, when I think about economics, yes, it's about investment being predictable and rate of return and all the good things business leaders like to talk about. But at the end of the day, what I've seen is without paying attention to economics, really good ideas falter and fail. And also, it's very difficult to have political consistency if your economy's going down. People tend then to say, I care about the environment, but I'm going to vote for jobs. So you always need to really take to heart that sustainable development is that triple bottom line. And I really believe in the mix, that this is about true leadership and it's not a zero-sum game. This is not about choice of either or, this is about leading with intention. So that's what I want to talk about. I also want to stress that I don't think there has been a more important time in our nation's history to think seriously about energy environment than where we are right now. And I'm thrilled to see folks like yourself taking time out of your busy days and lives to think about this, because it really is a call to action. It really is about vision and leadership and responsibility at this very unique and critical time. And it takes all of us from a variety of different vantage points to come together and look at real, meaningful solutions through innovation, social values, and much more quality discourse than we have in Canada today. So let's start with the elephant in the room, GHGs. And it's pretty obvious, particularly with the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that there's a very high level of confidence that humans are influencing climate change. And what we can do about this has been the subject of debate, not for years, but decades. It's very difficult to move forward, but very important. And it's difficult in no small measure because, as predicted by the International Energy Agency, GHGs come, about 2/3 of them are coming from the energy sector. And that energy sector, and it's not pushing the product, it's the demand globally, is continuing to grow. At the same time, as if that wasn't hard enough, as you probably know, the world is a growing place in terms of people, and those people are becoming more prosperous. I visited Africa recently with my husband, and it was a real eye-opener. Of course, you know, we've traveled quite a bit into different places, but when you see the kind of lives that people are living, I don't think it's realistic that from here in Canada we could suggest that the farmer in Kenya who's been walking to the market should not be able to buy that power bike and that jerry can of gasoline and got his products to market so he can provide a better life for his family. And reliability of electricity means he's not likely to look at an electric option anytime soon. We need to find the right balance, and by 2050, we will be home on this earth to 9.6 billion people, 2.5 billion more than today. So you can realize that there's major implications to that in terms of energy and environment, and of course the compounding of it in that all those extra people are also living longer, healthier, thriving lives, which is by any measure a good thing, but it does of course make that challenge just a little more difficult. A recent report by the World Bank says the percentage of people living in extreme poverty in the world today is less than half of what it was in 1990. And they believe it's actually possible to imagine that within a generation, extreme poverty could be effectively eliminated. That is great news for humanity and for any sort of ethics around a modicum of equity in the world. And as I said, though, that means that we have a daunting challenge in making sure that people can live healthier, more prosperous lives around the world, while we at the same time tackle some of these challenges related to climate change and energy needs. So of course, renewables is a fantastic opportunity. And all of the energy forecasts I've looked at are predicting a very, very significant improvement in the penetration of renewables in our energy sources. That's a good thing. And here in Canada, there are some wonderful things happening across the country. the pipeline industry, you would expect, I think you'd assume, is more seized with oil and gas. But I'm here to tell you that some of the larger pipeline companies in Canada are among some of the biggest investors in non-emitting power. And think about that. These are companies that for decades have been investing billions and billions of dollars in infrastructure that has a very, very, very slow return on money. They're used to investing $20 billion on something with a 30-year depreciation, more like a house mortgage than most companies would expect in terms of their return rate. So it's not that surprising that a company like TransCanada doing pipelines would also invest in Bruce Nuclear and own that facility, which is also big capital, long-term return, and solar, and wind farms, and run-of-river hydro. And several of our big pipeline companies are among the largest investors for non-emitting power in Canada, and I expect that they'll continue to do so. But even as renewable forecasts point to a good improvement in non-emitting energy, the world growth forecasts, particularly in Asia, are overtaking those renewable additions. And it is predicted that the growth of energy needs on a global level will call on at least as much fossil fuel use 30 years from now as today, and possibly even more. So I think what we need to do is really reframe how we're thinking about Canada's role in a world that is leading to more energy use and needs more responsibility in conservation, in innovation, in clean production, in safe transport, and in an awareness about how to move forward effectively. And I think we are uniquely placed in this country to participate in that regard. Firstly, on the GHG story. We, on a global level, contribute about 2% of all of the emissions in Canada compared to the whole world. So if Canada somehow got sucked off the planet tomorrow, the global GHG emission portfolio would change by 2%. I don't think that's a really material impact on a global level. We have a responsibility to lead and to demonstrate responsibility, but I think we also need to be realistic about the degree to which our actions actually impact the course that we're heading on. Within Canada, as tiny as our contribution is to the global climate change story, within Canada, of all of our emissions, only 5% is from oil sands. So on a global level, that's 0.15% total. And yet we hear, you would think from some of the rhetoric, that oil sands production is somehow going to be the death of the planet. I think anyone who has grade 2 algebra knows that's ridiculous. But we do need to focus on responsibility. So where, when, and if oil and gas is produced or transported, there is no reason why Canada cannot, should not, and will not be global leaders in terms of innovation and leadership on how to do that among the best in the world. And that's exactly what is happening today and what I expect we'll see even more of. We're at the center of these issues whether we like it or not. In our country, we have an accident of geology that has us sitting on major sources of energy, both hydro, uranium, oil and gas, coal. And we cannot divorce ourselves from the fact that this vast land has energy resources that the world wants and needs. We're attracting a lot of attention. You've heard, I'm sure, about international investments in Canada with respect to energy. One might ask, why is that? Well, clearly we're a friendly place. We're stable. We have good, predictable government. Our tax structures are tough but fair. But the bigger story on oil and gas is that internationally, the vast majority of reserves are held and controlled by state-owned enterprises. And they will do and produce what they wish on a global level, and for as long as there is oil demand, there will be production. 20% of the world's oil supply is available for private investment. In Canada, we have chosen to take advantage of private dollars to develop energy. Certainly the pipeline story in Canada is that way. We had a huge debate in this country in the 50s. It was actually so vigorous that a federal government fell over the pipeline debate in the 50s. There were really two issues on the table at the time. One was, should we have infrastructure on Canadian territory, or should it go the short way under the Great Lakes? Decision one was gas pipeline should be on Canadian territory, and that's the history of the Trans-Canada Pipeline. Question number two was, if it's critical infrastructure to meet energy needs for Canada, should that be funded by the federal government? Isn't that a public interest undertaking? Why would you not make that a crown corporation? But lo, these many years ago, the wisdom was, if we can find a way to get private money to invest, why wouldn't we? We can still regulate it. It's still a public interest undertaking, but it leverages private capital. And that's how pipelines have been built in Canada. So now when you look to the upstream to oil and gas development, as I said, only 20% of the world's oil supply can be invested in with private money. Fully half of that is right here in Canada. So if you are a global player and you want to be involved with development of oil and gas, you have two choices. One choice, go to Canada. Second choice, go someplace else. But they're equal in terms of the capacity that you can invest. So it's not surprising that we've attracted a lot of attention. So here we are. We are accident of geology, sitting on and stewarding a resource that is truly, truly second to none on the planet. We have a growing world with growing energy demand, looking to Canada to invest. And we have a strong ethic of doing the right thing at a time when climate change is of concern to all of us. And one other thing, as a country, we have a history of trade. How do you get new money into a country? You either make it worth investing in or you trade. And when you trade, the value of what you're selling is like new bucks in your jeans. In Canada today, 1 out of every $5 of mercantile trade value is energy. So where are we getting new money to fund schools, universities, anything you like to look at as a public good? 1 in $5 is coming from energy trade. So this is important. But one other big economic challenge for us today, which is directly related to a shortage of pipelines, is that we are not able to access the markets that would assure Canadians that they get top dollar for their resource. These are Canadian reserves for Canadians, and when you have a market distortion and you're not getting what they're worth, it's like donating money to somebody else. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce did a recent study that you can find on their website that was quite well analyzed, I think, and they found that that distortion is costing us about $50 million a day. So it's like writing a check and giving it away from Canada every day. And if we were instead able to trade internationally and actually have a competitive price for the reserves in Canada, in one day, we would pay for a new sports complex in Montreal. In 2 days, we'd pay for a year's worth of medical, laboratory, and drug supply for the hospital for sick kids. And in just 3 days, we would pay for a full year of funding for the federal government's homelessness partnership. These are staggering options in terms of their magnitude and scope. When you add new pipeline infrastructure, you give markets choices, and in having choices, they can get better value. So putting it another way, if you built Northern Gateway Pipeline and Trans Mountain so that you could access Asia effectively and Keystone, you would be able to hire 200,000 elementary school teachers every year. Every year. 500,000 four-year university degrees would be paid for. 500,000 Canadian university students could have a free pass just based on that access to markets. So there's a huge win-win here if we can do it well. The world needs energy. There's lots of it around, but the development of trade is lacking. The only game in town in terms of growth is Asia, and that is the best place for Canada to look. We've made commitments as a country to be responsible. We've made commitments in the past and today to contribute to security and economic prosperity. But unfortunately, some of our strategies in the past have been more what I would call strategies of hope. There's no point in setting a hopeful target if you have no plan and no ability to get there. We need to be much more intentional, and we need to work collaboratively to understand what will it actually take to be successful. Out of sheer frustration, a lot of folks have been starting to amp up the rhetoric, which is really unfortunate because I find it takes us further and further away from any kind of reasonable conversation. I know in pipelines, of course, we've come under a lot of attack because one of the strategies, if you want to stop oil sands, would be to try to prevent pipeline construction. Unfortunately, that's not going to make any difference anyway because oil will move, whether it's by train or truck. It will just take a lot more trains and a lot more trucks, but they'll get to market. However, some folks have deferred to tactics that I think are really, really unethical and unfortunately create unnecessary fear for folks. For example, how many of you have heard of diluted bitumen being corrosive in pipelines? That was in the news quite a bit a year or two ago. I'm glad that many of you have not heard that because it's actually false and it was created intentionally to create fear and mistrust. But at the end of the day, we don't get anywhere if we're arguing over fake facts and misperceptions. As you would all know, being involved in this space, you really need to drive in with intention to what's actually going to make a difference. We need a much more positive path forward for better mutual understanding and across the whole country, work closer together. We need a fresh start, I think, and within our own industry, we've been working hard at that. It starts with collaboration because even though our individual companies might compete, you can get a lot further faster on safety, on environmental protection, on emergency response, and things like that if you're able to work together. There are big industry programs you're probably familiar with, like Responsible Care. And in pipelines, we're doing the same thing in something called CEPA Integrity First. But it actually starts with people and meeting needs. This is what the Brundtland Commission determined back in the 80s when, for the first time on a world level, people asked, how the heck do you solve these intractable environmental issues? And they spent 3 years going around and trying to look at what are these issues and how do you address them, and discovered that it really comes down to the future needs being able to be met while the current needs are met. And I have seen some big changes in the business world. I've been doing this job for about 6 years now, and I've been involved with business in other ways before that, as well as regulation and academia. The really exciting thing is this issue of collaborating toward greatest effect, of driving hard into risk management solutions and making sure that we set the bar high. In our case, 0 incidents is the goal. When it comes to safety and environmental performance, we're absolutely committed to collaborate rather than compete. It's absolutely essential. We're creating a new external advisory panel to make sure that we can understand a lot of different voices. And that's what I think is so important about the involvement of universities, because that's your space, an ability to have open, honest, critical dialogue. And too often when we get into a polarized setting, that gets diminished. But I also think we need to change the dial in how we talk about these issues. I meet with a lot of senior executives who are well-meaning people who have families themselves. And you ask them, any of them, are you doing the right thing? And they'll say, absolutely, yes, we're doing the right thing. And I'll ask them, what do you think matters? And they'll say things like, well, we provide a positive return to shareholders. We're the stewards of hard-earned money for people who are retirees or who have trust funds for the education of their kids. We operate safely. We invest in innovation. We drive the technology for the future. We produce hundreds of thousands of barrels of energy that people need every day. We're the engine of growth in the country. They'll say, I create jobs. If it weren't for industry, we would have no economy. That's all good stuff, but I think we need to speak more from what's on the minds and in the hearts of folks. And I think that what I hear behind the words, but what isn't visible enough, is language more like this. And I'm speaking as president of the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association, and what I'm about to say I really, really do believe is in the hearts of most of the people I work with, if not all. And that is, we have a responsibility each and every day. There are a lot of people counting on us. We move virtually all of the oil and gas that's used and produced in Canada every day. And we need that energy in our lives in Canada and around the world. And delivering that is critical. We're also stewards of billions of hard-earned savings, and we need to be cost effective. But beyond that, at the top of the list, what we do each and every day is about keeping people safe, to have every mom and dad go home to their families at the end of the day, and leave every part of the land that we have borrowed to do that infrastructure for Canada as good as we found it. And act with the duty of care that we would, as if that land that we borrowed was our own land to be used for the enjoyment of our own grandchildren. And in so doing, meet the needs of our society today and in the future. Now, I know that language doesn't sound like business language, but I think it needs to be. And I think that the innovation, whether it's social innovation, technical innovation, regulatory innovation, all of the things that bring us together around addressing Canadian needs has got to be keyed in to those sort of values. We all have to be accountable for the triple bottom line, for the energy trilemma that we face in the world. We may be desperately concerned about climate change, and we should be, but we will not be any more successful in the next 30 years than we have been in the last 30 years unless we actually start to think and behave differently around this issue. We have to base our intentions on solid information, not mythology, not strategies of hope, not demonization, and not being polarized. And to achieve that, we have to be honest, transparent, and engaging. We need to roll up our sleeves and talk about it. We need to embrace healthy skepticism and critical thinking. We need to do something, take a stand, and speak out. But part of that is the accountability of everyone involved in the dialogue, from a CEO in the C-suite down to someone choosing of their own volition to protest. Both ends of that spectrum have responsibilities to the societies in which they operate, and both ends of that spectrum need to be brought to bear on the solutions rather than demonizing and preventing the opportunity to move forward effectively. I see real progress every day. For example, in Alberta, just one example, the carbon tax collected there has now achieved the opportunity, the activation of leveraging to $1.3 billion worth of innovation projects underway, specifically targeted at reducing GHGs and consumption of oil and gas. I sit on their board, and I can see the power of innovation where investments are intentional and directed towards specific problems that we need to solve. 1.3 billion sounds like a lot. It's not a lot when you put it up against the numbers I shared with you earlier at $50 million a day, or about 16 or 17 billion a year. Canada can do better, and Canada needs to do better. The same would go for ICT, for advanced detection, for genome research. I met last week with the head of Alberta Genome, and it's really exciting to see how the integration of different technologies can actually really make a difference. There are some great ideas about how genome technology, whether it's from here, I know just down the road on Guelph, there's some really active research as well. There are great opportunities to deploy that in industrial problems, as you all know. Our goal in pipelines is zero incidents, and we're mobilizing that. We support the polluter pay principle, and that means hefty liability charges, but I think it's the right thing to do. And we have a mutual emergency assistance agreement in place across our industry for an all hands on deck kind of approach. I'm very confident that we'll get where we need to be and achieve that zero incident rating, but that's our job one. What I worry about most beyond the technology is this deep and corrosive negativity. I think it undermines the very fabric of our country, and I think it disables the very solutions that people want to achieve. And I refuse to believe that we cannot take hold firmly of the greatest strengths this country has ever offered the world. And those are values-based, intentional qualities of discourse, of respect, and informed debate. It is not a given. It is not a given that our country will maintain those strengths. And in the job I do, sadly, I see many, many examples every day where that is explicitly, directly, and intentionally at threat. Because if you don't have a pragmatic solution to the energy environment challenges, it's a way easier game to demonize. It's much harder to actually solve problems. And the current situation is highly corrosive to the public sphere. It undermines accountability, and it's undermining our trust in public institutions. We asked a couple thousand Canadians recently some questions to better understand what was on their minds. And one that came back that really concerned me was when asked, would you trust your regulator to safeguard your interests? Only 1/3 of Canadians said yes. That is a shocking number. What that says is, even though on a world level, and I go to regulatory conferences, I worked in that space, Canadian regulators are very highly regarded as expert, as running thorough processes. Our environmental assessment is among some of the most thorough in the world. And yet, in Canada, we have reached a point where there's a deep level of lack of faith, let's say. So where do you turn for confidence? One would hope you would turn to industry, to stronger regulation, to more transparency, to the things that would build up social fabric. Instead, sometimes, sadly, we see a diminishment of the social fabric, as if that's actually going to make us better off. So I think it's time to step up, not step back, and to become active in a productive, forward way, not complacent. All actors, every single citizen, all activists, all regulators, all business leaders need to do the right thing. And the right thing includes responsibility. It includes mobilizing our current resources to make sure that we can transition that global energy mix to a better future, and in so doing, harness the forces that we are dealing with today and leverage to the maximum extent possible what is going to make for pan-Canadian excellence. We can and need to be pivotal leaders on the world stage, and it doesn't mean shutting everything down. I think it's quite the opposite. It's seizing the inheritance that we have in Canada of innovation, of public discourse that's effective, of intention, and of the resources that we have in this great land at our stewardship accountability. So groups like this, this gathering tonight, Waterloo Institute for Sustainable Energy, really working hard to develop innovative solutions and policies that help transform energy. I think that's incredibly positive. It's absolutely the right step in the right direction. I'm really grateful to be here tonight, and I look forward to hearing your questions and in opening up the debate about what an incredible opportunity this is for Canada, an unparalleled place in the world, and it's our moment to act and act with intention and unlock that opportunity. We can't be complacent. That's the main message at this critical juncture. We're big-hearted pragmatists, and we're known for collaboration, and we're known for doing the right thing. So what are the next steps for all of us? That's my question to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brenda Kenny. That was a wonderful lecture, and it raised a lot of important questions for all of us. So I'd just like to open the floor to questions. We don't have a mic. We feel this room is fine for voice carry. So if you'd like to ask a question, just step up and say your name. Eric.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks a lot for this overall presentation. That was really challenging. So my question is a kind of general question. That means, if I understood well, if we want to push for innovation, we have to base innovation on a very wealthy and solid economy, which makes sense. I mean, you need to get money to use money. In parallel, there are all this debate, and as I say, that everyone acknowledges the fact that the human contribution to GHG and that's something that has to be done, not only for the global warming, but someday these fossil fuels will disappear. So where do you put the frontier, the balance between the use of revenues, of course, to make the current economy running and being able to pay and support everything, and the investments that should be done to show that Canada would be a leader not only on what is good at right now,
Yep.
in the new technology, new innovation, and as we are talking about sustainable energy.
Yeah. Oh, great question. And the reason I included some of the statistics about the global GHG and Canada's part of it and oil sands' part in that is that I hear some extraordinary rhetoric with respect to the component that contributes on a global level. And I think that it's clearly just ridiculous on the scale of a reality check. So if you say, I'm seized with climate change, and I accept, and this is a big if, and this is where you move from strategy of hope to reality check. If we accept that the range of credible energy forecasts suggests that fossil fuels will be produced and used for a while yet, even if we wish that weren't the case, then the question I ask myself is, where in the world are the most strident investments possible, let alone being made, on innovation with respect to both clean production, clean transport, and efficiency of use, while we also look at those renewables? And my premise is that the art of the possible only happens when there's money to invest in that. So premise number one, let's shut down the Canadian energy industry because we feel uncomfortable about producing oil. The implication of that, in my humble opinion, is it will make zero difference materially in terms of global emissions. It'll make zero difference globally in terms of energy use because there's still vast reserves elsewhere. And it will take away from the innovation that is available in Canada that could actually have a ripple effect around the world in terms of conservation and smart production. So if you think about it this way, and I'll come back to renewables in a minute, but just focusing first on oil. So for every barrel of oil produced in the world, about 80% of the emissions are from the actual use of that barrel. We need to get good at conservation and conversion. While we're using those barrels of oil, the top 20% is from production. There's some variability, but it's not vast. In the world today, there's one stock exchange that has the highest number of active energy solution service companies on the planet. That stock exchange is the TSX. So we have the makings in Canada to be the most innovative, the most productive, and the most well invested in the world on solving some of these problems. I'll use an example from the genome world, for instance, and tough hydrocarbon development is going on all over the place around the world. Again, us stopping production in Canada will have no impact other than to remove investment dollars in innovation. What we are doing in Canada is very creative in looking at how, for example, this is one example, how genome solutions might actually be used to break up hydrocarbons to make them smaller and more usable. And that means no energy as an input. So you bring down that production quantity quite considerably. Same kind of investment opportunities in pipelines. We have huge pipelines in Canada. We have a big country, 100,000 kilometers of big energy highways. That pales in comparison to China and Russia and elsewhere. Do you really think that you're going to see the same level of investment on innovation that drives towards zero incidents in Siberia? I rather doubt it. And yet, if Canadian companies had breakthrough improvements through activist investment, that might be something we could market around the world. Manufacturers of those innovations here in Canada could do well for Canada, and we'd be doing much better on the environment around the whole world. So I think that it's in the camp of, while we're using fossil fuels, and we can debate how quickly we can remove off of them, but this is not a strategy of hope on my part. This is most of the credible energy forecasts say it'll be a while. While we're doing that, we have a vested interest and a responsibility to do that among the best in the world. Now, the second part of that equation is getting off fossil fuels. And it's partly, of course, efficiency of use. And we all know, how many people here have bought a car in the last little while? Probably not too many because they're students, but I'll just say I had been driving a Mini for 6 years, and I have 3 giant sons, and they were getting tired of the back seat. So I said, okay, I'll look at getting another car. And the benchmark I was given by my husband, who drives a Prius, was you cannot buy another car unless it's more fuel efficient than the Mini. So that gave me a challenge, which I finally did solve. But there are not very many products on the market for consumers that are, in fact, what you would call particularly energy efficient yet. And I think we can do a lot more in innovation there. Why does it matter to Canada? Why did I talk about the trade deficit and that $50 million a day? Is simply that there is, when governments across this country are running deficits, there is no new money. There will not be peak investment in innovation unless we have a strong economy. And my argument is we should be brave enough to invest in and develop and progress with the resources we have today and convert that capital into the innovations that we need for tomorrow and market those around the world. Saying, stop, I'm afraid, is a recipe for disaster and doesn't help climate change at all.
Recently in The Economist there was an article that was saying that wasn't raising a question. The title is Canada has become a reckless petrol state, and it was comparing the way that petroleum is being exploited in Canada with other countries that are responsible, let's say, in the exploitation of petroleum, like Norway. And the article described how Canada was not following the same path as Norway, but was following more the path of other countries like Nigeria, and they're known to be reckless petrol states, in the sense that the development of oil gets peaks and goes up, but the economy is not going up, and the innovations and the stuff that you're talking are not moving at the same rate that other nations who exploit also oil are doing. And they were basically comparing that. The numbers of Canada against Norway and the numbers of Canada in some countries in Africa. So why do you think Canada is not having the same impact or is moving at the same pace like Norway, for example?
Yeah.
What you say it can be.
Well, I think that it's an unfortunate and misleading comparison to put Canada and Nigeria in the same place. Our transparency of investment, our regulatory regimes, our publish what you pay, et cetera, are just a completely different class of country. We have a thriving democracy, as does Norway. Our democracy has chosen to be slightly more market-based and slightly less socialist. And that is a choice that every voter contributes to and participates in every election cycle. I would say that you do have the attention of most governments in the country today with respect to science, technology, and innovation. And you would know better than me in terms of the total quantum. And obviously, there's more to the upside, the more that we can move that forward and the more that we can reinvest in future. I was recently appointed to the Alberta Economic Development Authority, and the primary interest of the Premier in setting that new board of 12 people is to look at diversification and a long-term view in terms of the health of that province. And I think that the Climate Change Emissions Management Corporation and the bold move of having a carbon tax that was dedicated to innovation is a good, strong signal that that is a province that's pretty serious about that. Would we see Canada become like Norway? I rather doubt it, not because I don't like the idea personally, but I have lived in 4 different regions and I haven't seen us as a citizenry vote in that direction yet. So that is why the discourse is important, to have a good intentional dialogue about where do you want to go as a country. But regardless of whether you err on the side of the Norwegian model or something more market-based, I think you can still unlock a lot of value, as is already happening. For instance, in oil sands with the investments through CEPA, or in our case, there's about $100 million worth of investment in technology going on within the private enterprise. That can work well too. And all of those investments result in better performance and often result in suppliers that are leading the way on a global level in selling that performance elsewhere, creating jobs in Canada and delivering better environmental results. So there's lots of different ways to skin the cat, but I think at the end of the day, it's all a moot point if you don't have government surpluses or you don't have economic health where companies can invest extra in innovation. So that's my central argument, is don't be afraid of economic health and being intentional on a global level. And that economic health comes with global trade. Yes?
How do you propose exactly that we begin to engage in that dialogue and to sort of analyze the values that are brought out amongst the different provinces and across the country?
That is a great question, and I'm hoping that you'll answer that through your career and work with WISE, because I think that there are more tools for a national debate now, perhaps in some ways than in the past. There's opportunities to try new things, and I think declaring the values and the policy intention is really important, and not allowing ourselves to get sucked into the polarized position where we are right now. I think step one is have enough belief in Canadian values and mutual respect to at least begin the conversation, and trust that each other is trying to get to the right place. That is not the case today. I think that there are a lot of folks who think that that industry cannot be trusted. Unfortunately, I personally don't think it's deserved, but that may be how they feel. And similarly, I can honestly say that I asked a good friend of mine recently who is very involved with the environmental network. I asked him, who could I sit down and have a conversation with to do exactly as you're saying, let's start this. And who could I trust who would really willingly begin that conversation rather than just be trying to leverage any misstep as a win on the side of an opener to use it against me or somebody else. And I was very disappointed and disturbed when he said, I honestly don't know who I would suggest you talk to. There's almost nobody there. So that's the depth of the rift right now, which is really sad. And I think it's fundamental that we first and foremost start with values and a basis of trust. But even without the discourse, so I guess my invitation to anybody here today would be check in your own heart. And if you're feeling cynical, and if you're feeling like you're demonizing any parties in these discussions, check your own heart, because it starts with us.
Just a quick question. I think you make a good case for the economics of oil and gas predominantly in Canada. Just going back to the GHGs for a second, you mentioned that 2% is attributed to Canada, and you seem to suggest that that's a small amount, but for a country of 33 million people, I think it's kind of large considering there are 7 billion. The other question I had is about, you were talking about the energy used to produce a barrel of oil, and was that for oil sands, or was that for general oil or
There are various numbers, and they're all transparently available with respect to oil sands production, and depending on the type of production method, the actual emissions will vary. But in the basket of crude oil that's imported to North America today, it's comparable. And so it'll depend on the actual process that's being deployed, and they're not all the same. But yes, I was including them in that mix, and the point I would make is that unlike some of those other comparators who are not transparent or verifiable and who are not investing in innovation to bring those numbers down, that it is a false hope that there would be any change because there will still be oil produced. So it's that issue of do you kind of step back and say, oh, I'm kind of nervous about this, so let's just stop? Or do you step into it and say, I have an accountability to make this right? On your point about, I totally agree with you. Like, we're energy hogs. I cringe, like I have to travel quite a bit with my job, and you can well imagine just coming here from Calgary was, somebody's annual budget in terms of GHG emissions if you're trying to do the 5-10 limit or however you set for yourself. And, so as I said, we all do our own personal calculus on vehicle choice or ridership on public transit or the things that are within our control. But part of the challenge for us in Canada, as you would well know, living here in the industrial heartland, is you don't have very many good examples of sophisticated economies that don't have a fairly hefty portion of energy use that makes it possible to produce and use the kinds of products that create that economic wealth. And people in this room are more expert at this than me, so please weigh in if you object to anything I'm saying here. But my understanding is, for instance, in Germany, some of the downturn on their actual GHG emissions, a fairly significant portion of it, in fact, is attributable to offshoring manufacturing and production to China. So when we're dealing with a reality check on addressing GHGs on a global level, I think we just have to be really honest about that, because we get these bizarre sort of perverse outcomes. Like right now, Germany is, since Fukushima, Germany has said, oh, I'm afraid of nuclear, I don't want to do nuclear. So they've shut down nuclear, they're importing nuclear power from France, and they're buying coal from the US while the US converts their coal plants to natural gas. And you're sort of like, wait a second, I thought this was all one atmosphere. So there's some very bizarre perversions that come from artificially ring fencing. So that's my only point. With respect to Canadian energy and the role that pipelines play in meeting Asia, my only point is, if Asians are going to be growing their economies, and if the energy forecasts are to be believed, it is highly likely they will buy and use more oil and gas. And not engaging them in trade does not create a relationship of trust that can lead to better innovation, more conservation, effective joint projects. And not engaging them in trade does not affect their bell curve in terms of energy use. State-owned enterprises will continue to produce and sell as much as they can. So it is ultimately unproductive to the climate change solutions to imperil our ability as Canadians to actually have an economy that can invest in innovation, can hold ourselves to account, can be transparent, and can lead the world in terms of what we expect of energy transport, energy use, energy production, and conversion to non-emitting sources. We are so well placed to do that well that it just is, it is such a crying shame to be allowing ourselves to be paralyzed in an artificial discourse. And so that's what keeps me up at night.
Well, I believe Brenda will be with us for a short while after the talk. So if all of you could just join me in thanking Brenda for taking the time out of her busy schedule and the fascinating talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Ah.
Oh, what? Thank you. Thank you, Prachi. Thank you very much. Well, great questions. Please let me know if you've got other thoughts.